Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is the 4991 series, episode number 3. Yeah, I do like the women's only panels, and that's the way we're going with this one. And we're talking about, the diva herself, probably one of the original divas from my generation, Miss Mary J. Blige, My Life album, which is 20. I still don't know how I'm feeling about all these major albums turning 20. Yeah, so we have an all-star panel, like for real, an all-star panel of some of the brightest and wonderfulest and most fashion-forwardest ladies in the Academy. Dr. Emily Lordy, Dr. Tanisha Ford, and Dr. Treva Lindsay. What's going on, ladies? How y'all doing today?
Hello.
Wow.
All this beautifulness, all this beautifulness. I'm gonna try hard not to gush too bad. I got crushes on all y'all. So, let's go ahead and get the conversation started. How did you become a fan of Mary J. Blige, the My Life album? Emily, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to hang out with some of my favorite scholars. And with the Mary J. Blige My Life album in particular, this is interesting for me because as a white scholar of African American culture and music, it's always interesting to me to see kind of what does and does not cross certain lines, certain things that cannot be learned. And so for me, growing up in a very sort of white New England suburb in the 90s, Mary J. was unfortunately one of those things that just was not sort of really part of the musical landscape, right? And this is part of, I think, a larger story about the way that the music industry and radio get sort of resegregated in this sort of post-New Jack Swing type of moment. But in any case, that's to say that my sort of interest in this album and in Mary J. more generally is more kind of from a scholarly perspective, so rather than from an experiential perspective. And my scholarly interest in her, though, is considerable because I've been working for the past several years on Black women singers, right? Exploring the connections between their work and that of 20th century African American writers. And it's been very important for me as I study and write about these women's work to stress to not read their work just as an expression of their lived experience, right? But rather to really stress craft, intentionality, different choices that they're making. And this is me sort of coming out of a particular intellectual tradition of jazz studies, which says rather than read musicians' work as sort of an expression of their life, we need to think about, craft and invention, right? Otherwise, we enforce these kind of primitivist myths of the natural Black entertainer, right? And so in my work, I'm thinking about technique, craft, invention, and yet, as you might imagine, Mary J. really kind of throws a wrench into that whole sort of approach, right? Because she, as much as any contemporary singer, insists that we read her music as an expression of her own real lived experience, right? So obviously, in this album, just titling it My Life, like you can't get much more explicit about that connection than that. But I think, there's different ways to read that. And just briefly, one thing that I was thinking about is the way in which her insistence that her music does come out of her life is a way of both participating in but also revising and regendering this sort of hip-hop, keep it real ethos, right? So she's saying, like, I am keeping it real, my music is coming right out of things that I have actually lived through, but she's also saying, okay, but if we're going to keep it real, we have to say not only what happened, but also how it felt, right? If we're going to be real, we have to talk about how things are scary, they're painful, they're hurtful, sometimes you feel lost. And so in that way, I actually see her own sort of commitment to a certain kind of, like, affective sincerity as both, again, sort of participating in, but also really interestingly revising that hip-hop, keep it real ethos. So, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Lindsay, what you got for me? When did you become MJB everything?
Wow. I'm MJB from day one. So I think that very, very powerful debut with What's the 411 solidified it for me. Here you have this straight out of just energy, like it's so much energy, it's so much performative narrative that's happening when MJB steps on the scene, and you want to believe her. And on What's the 411, you have much more male authorship, you have certain ideas about love, and you have the remake of Sweet Thing. You have very particular notions of what people imagine Black womanhood to be. My Life does a certain kind of interior work. And I think that's what made it the album it is. And I do want to point out that her debut and sophomore album are probably two of the best kind of combination albums from any artist we've seen in the late 20th century. I mean, both are innovative, inventive in terms of sound, in terms of narrative and impact and what it means to moving a genre forward. I think we really underestimate Mary J. Blige in that way. But she offers something on My Life that is unpolished, that is, when I say raw, I don't mean in this very kind of negative sensibility, but there's something so decidedly unfinished about the project. And I mean that to mean it is a complete musical innovation, but it is incomplete in its feeling, in its sensibility. It leaves you with a particular kind of longing. And an album conveying that from top to bottom, where you see the search, you see journey, you see that longing being evoked sonically, is just something intensely powerful. And she moves you. I think that's something we often underestimate as well, that we see something within hip-hop that moves us, that galvanizes something within you. And in 1994, I'm coming into my young womanhood at that point. So being able to have a soundtrack that includes someone like a Mary J. Blige who's struggling through any number of things in her actual life, but the kinds of struggles she places on the album that we can then read as its own text, mirrored so much of what I think a lot of black girls, black young women, and black women broadly were experiencing in this moment. And the 90s become this heralding and amazing moment for black women expressivity to come to a certain kind of forefront within our own cultural spaces. And I kind of like that she didn't cross over in a certain kind of way with this one. My Life was not intentionally a crossover album. It was about centering a black woman's experience, and I think speaking to a hip-hop generation audience that she largely defined and articulated as black or African American identified.
Dr. Ford?
Yeah, so for me, What's the 411 hooked from the moment that album dropped, particularly Real Love. I love the video for Real Love. I actually went and cut out a baseball cap so that I could put a ponytail, braids like this, through the top of the hat so I could be like Mary. You know, wanted to learn all the choreography for the video. It was really a soundtrack for that late middle school moment in my life where I was part of girl dance groups, where we would dress alike, like the girls in the Real Love video, and do the synchronized choreography at the talent shows at school. And so for me, that album really kind of captured that more youthful feeling that we had in those middle school years. But at the same moment, when I told my friends in my dance group, we need to come up with a model for who we are as black women. And so then I borrowed from Yo-Yo's Intelligent Black Women Coalition. So we started calling ourselves the IBW at our school, and had the hoodies with our little baseball caps. And so really there was a way in which there was a burgeoning sense of young womanhood that Mary J. Blige was really a part of for me. So then if I think about the My Life album, that happens at this really important juncture, I think, in a young black girl's life, where you move from junior high school to high school. So then you start having a whole different set of conversations around your body, about what it means to move through this space, even what it means as a dancer to be moving and jumping around on stage when your body itself has started to develop. And so really the My Life album for me was literally the soundtrack for my first real relationship. And I mean that in the sense that, he actually owned the CD, and we would literally drive around in the car listening to My Life. And so, and isn't that deep, listening to My Life? So there's a way in which I'm listening to Mary J. Blige sing about her life while I'm living my life as a young black woman who is really entering into this romantic terrain with a person who would be my partner for the next, off and on for the next several years up through college. So there's a way that for me that album kind of lived on as part of my my own experiences with love and what that looked like, through the hurt, the pain, the disappointment, all the other unexpected elements that came along with that. So for me, Mary J. Blige's first two albums speak to this early kind of arc in my womanhood from junior high to high school.
I mean, it leads into the conversation when I was talking to the ladies on the previous panel about TLC's Crazy, Sexy, Cool, is this overarching conversation and multiple entry points into what black girlhood looks like at the end of the 20th century in ways that, unfortunately, we don't have now. You know what I'm saying? I mean, for every TLC's Crazy, Sexy, Cool, you had the Aaliyah or the Brandy. You know what I'm saying? But this particular album is... It's a great album, but it's also, for me, at points, a really dark album. You know what I'm saying? Like when you know, Treva, when you were talking about that interior work, that's what I was thinking about, is actually confronting the issues and concerns that are affecting women of color, you know, profusely, especially domestic violence, for example, which is one of the, you know, heavy underlying factors of the album. But I actually want to, Treva, go to you for this part of the conversation to start this off. She talks about these various levels of violence in her on the album, whether it's physical violence, emotional violence. You know, what does that do in terms of placing her in this hip-hop narrative that is kind of taking over what we understand, you know, black popular culture and black gender roles to look like?
Wow, that's a powerful question. I mean, the tone of the album, the song that sticks out to me beyond, obviously, the title track, is the idea of be happy, right? This all I really want is to be happy, to find a love that's mine and to be so sweet, right? So in this moment, you know, I'm decidedly unhappy. Like there's something very real about that kind of vulnerability and honesty being placed on the album and being a single from the album. It's not a hidden track. Be Happy has a video. Be Happy is a song that's featured, that gets remixed. You know, it's the 90s, so everything gets a remix. Still Diddy, so we know it's gonna have the remix. And she is particularly incisive at the moment that she's singing this. I mean, it's at the point where she's dissolving a certain relationship with Casey Haley, who's in many ways a member of Jodeci, another really important group to thinking about 90s music landscape. And his brother is one of the writers on My Life as an album. So take that for a second and put that into the conversation of layering as to what's going on. When her father re-enters her life, her own struggles with addiction that are coming through in this. And I think she's asking us to confront, as Emily mentioned earlier, something that is decidedly keeping to this hip-hop aesthetic of being real. That when she gets the opportunity to be the author of the narrative, to not just be the author of the performative narrative, but the actual lyrical narrative and the text that we get, it is a darker tone. It is something that's not satisfied with what her relationship is to hip-hop generation men. It is something that she becomes a conduit for their emotionality, but she's creating space for her to be vulnerable. And I think we often think of women's spaces as spaces that are always overdetermined by emotionality, that that's one of the kind of key stereotypical factors. But I don't think we get to situate black women's emotional core interiority into that conversation very often. And that articulations in particular about love and feeling like one deserves love is actually a radical kind of moment to take root. And by radical in that sense, of literally taking root on these songs. So when she's singing and she's doing the Mary Bop, which the Mary Bop is all over What's the 411, right? It's this embodied performance. It's all of this. It's down in here that Mary's gonna give you. She might even do a kick on her performance. Like she's gonna be on the ground, she's gonna be doing that. My Life aesthetically takes her to the stool. It takes her back to the microphone in certain kinds of ways. The performative aspect of the narrative decidedly shifts because there's a different emotional vocabulary that she's tapping into in order to articulate black women's experiences and letting you know, hey, we're here, and it ain't all good. And if I keep it really real, we're going to have to actually deal with violence. We're going to actually have to deal with addiction. We're going to actually have to deal with the fact that as a black woman and as black women, we face certain realities as hip-hop generation women.
Mm-hmm. Emily or Tanisha?
Yeah, so I think, too, it's really important to situate this into the historical moment of the early 1990s when there's so much violence, against Black bodies broadly in the community. You know, we have, there was all the hoopla on social media about the O.J. Simpson trial, remembering O.J. You also have the L.A. riots a few years earlier. And so there's a way that the way that Black men are invoking narratives of violence in hip-hop in this time period, people are seeing it as a direct response to a lot of the state-sanctioned violence. And so for that reason, it becomes a violence that we read as legible. We can say, yes, we can understand white on black and brown violence, right? We can understand what the state is doing to Black men in particular, right? And the rap narratives become a part of this historical moment. But there's a way in which we don't then give the same type of legitimacy to the violence that Mary J. Blige is experiencing in her own personal life and that she's singing about on her tracks. And it's this type of violence that often goes unrecognized and silenced. But as we know, particularly us as, you know, Black feminist thinkers, that it's precisely this type of violence that we need to have someone shed light on. So there's a way that Mary J. Blige is using a hip-hop soul aesthetic to rewrite how we even discuss violence as a people. And what does that violence, what do we do with that violence when we can't so neatly fit it into a package of state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown bodies, but really what happens when it's intimate partner violence?